Hello, this is Gina Piscatelli with the first lecture on the muscular system. And in this particular chapter, we're going to look at how muscle tissue functions, so it's physiology. But before we start on physiology, though, we look at some anatomy and not just of skeletal muscle, which will be our main focus, but also smooth muscle and cardiac muscle. So to begin with, I just wanted to mention the pictures on this opening slide. The lower left picture of skeletal muscle is taken of a whole muscle. So you can see the connective tissue that surrounds the entire muscle. And then deep inside, you see fascicles, which are groups of cells, which we commonly see when we cook meat, muscle fascicles like that. I just thought it was really beautiful. And we also see a picture on the upper right here of different types of smooth muscle located in different parts of the body. The one I want to mention is on the left here. This is a picture of the outside of a blood vessel, and you can see the longitudinal smooth muscle cells kind of surrounding the blood vessel. Both of these pictures were taken with a type of microscopy that uses electrons, and electrons bounce off of the surface of the object you're viewing instead of light penetrating. So it's called scanning electron microscopy. And so you get a really nice surface image of the object you're looking at. It's just beautiful. Okay, in terms of our material, today we're going to start with the different types of muscle tissue, which you'll be somewhat familiar with. The three types are skeletal muscle, cardiac muscle, and smooth muscle. And of course, they're found in different locations. Skeletal muscle is found within skeletal muscles. So skeletal muscle tissue is found within whole organs called skeletal muscles that are attached to the skeleton, and they contribute to our ability to move. Cardiac muscle is, of course, only found in the heart. And smooth muscle is found in a variety of locations. This particular picture is meant to illustrate the fact that smooth muscle can be found in the wall of hollow organs, like the stomach that I just outlined there. We've already talked about what these different tissue types look like under the microscope. And so you'll recognize the striations in skeletal muscle tissue and the intercalated discs in cardiac muscle tissue, and probably also the longitudinal and tapered nuclei within smooth muscle cells. So these microscopy images illustrate that the cells are quite different in each of the three muscle tissue types. Skeletal muscle cells are the largest. They can range from 1 millimeter to a few centimeters long, and they're elongated. They're also multinucleated, so you'll have many nuclei. And this is because during development, many cells fuse together, but this is considered one cell. And cardiac muscle cells, or myocytes, are branched. Sometimes they look kind of uniform, cylindrically, but most often they have kind of odd ends because they're so branched. And this just reflects the fact that the heart needs to contract in a certain way, three-dimensionally, for the blood to be moved into the right chamber of the heart. And smooth muscle cells are elongated and tapered at the ends, and these are the smallest of all the cell types. Regardless of which type of muscle tissue you're talking about, they all have these characteristics in common. They're all excitable. They're responsive. They can react to chemical signals and sometimes a physical signal as well, like stretch. They are all conductive electrically, that means, so they can propagate an electrical charge, much like a neuron can. They're contractible. That means they shorten or constrict, causing movement of part of the body, maybe a very small part like a blood vessel, or maybe a very large part like an entire limb. Every tissue type is extensible. That means that every cell can stretch beyond its resting length and not be harmed, still able to contract. And all the tissue types are elastic, meaning after they're stretched, they can recoil back to a resting length. Now they vary, these different tissue types, they vary in how they're controlled, how contraction is controlled or regulated. Skeletal muscle, we know, is something that we can voluntarily contract. So we consider it controlled by the somatic nervous system. And the somatic nervous system has motor neurons that leave the spinal cord and innervate a whole muscle. And branches of the neuron will innervate individual muscle cells. So this picture on the right shows one muscle cell present in this whole muscle with many axon terminals innervating it, and a neurotransmitter is released at those axon terminals called acetylcholine. Then smooth muscle we consider involuntary because we cannot consciously control its contraction. So it is controlled by the autonomic nervous system, and autonomic neurons, leave different parts of the central nervous system, travel to a ganglion, and then another neuron travels to the smooth muscle, the organ. Now, this motor neuron might have axon terminals, much like we saw in skeletal muscle. But often what you'll find instead are varicosities at the end of an axon, many little bulbs that contain neurotransmitter. And so neurotransmitter is released from all of these different bulbs and kind of coats the smooth muscle. There's two types of neurotransmitters that are released and control contraction in smooth muscle: acetylcholine and norepinephrine. Norepinephrine, you might remember, is part of the sympathetic nervous system, whereas acetylcholine is parasympathetic. Two branches of the autonomic nervous system. Now, cardiac muscle contraction is an interesting study in control or regulation. We consider it involuntary because you can't consciously control contraction of your heart, right? And contraction is considered autorhythmic because there are pacemaker cells that automatically send out an electrical signal to contractile cells in the heart muscle. So the pacemaker is called the SA node. There's also an AV node, but the SA node is the main pacemaker for the heart, and it sends out an electrical signal once every 6 seconds or so, and the contractile cells respond by contracting, of course. Now, that happens at a certain rate, the rate at which the SA node sends out a signal. But the heart contraction, or contraction of the heart, can be modified by the autonomic nervous system, also hormones, and the degree of stretch. So, let's start with the autonomic nervous system. you probably recall that the sympathetic nervous system will speed up the heart. And you'll see here the green neuron innervates what's called the SA node, the AV node, as well as the heart muscle. So the rate will go up, but so will the force of contraction due to sympathetic input. The parasympathetic nervous system, in contrast, decreases the heart rate. And you can see by the picture that the purple neuron, which is the parasympathetic neuron, only controls rate. It won't change the force of the contraction, just how often contraction occurs. There are hormones, like epinephrine is a hormone that will change the heart rate, and the degree of stretch changes the force. So the more blood that's pumped back into the heart, the greater the stretch on the wall of the heart and the greater the force of contraction. That's why physical activity is so important for keeping your heart healthy. You're returning blood back to the heart, stretching it just enough to increase its force of contraction. Now, we talked about intercalated discs in cardiac muscle tissue, which this is the SA node with a few cells, cardiac muscle cells, and the intercalated discs are right here. Okay, there's a number of them. They're at the ends of each cell. Within the intercalated disc is a channel that we call a gap junction. And this gap junction allows the spread of electrical current between cells very quickly. Interestingly, some types of smooth muscle, I should say, but smooth muscle also has gap junctions between cells. So an electrical impulse can spread from cell to cell as the ions are moving within that channel or through the channel. I mentioned that muscle tissue can be stretched and then still function, and that's true. In addition, stretch sometimes provides a stimulus changing contraction in some way. So for skeletal muscle, if you stretch a muscle to about 120% of its resting length, that will increase the force of the contraction. But if you stretch it too much, that will actually decrease the force of contraction. Smooth muscle is unique in that it spontaneously contracts in response to stretch, so without any neural stimulation. Skeletal muscle, even though I said stretch increases the force, you still have to have a neuron telling that skeletal muscle to contract. But smooth muscle, when it's stretched, it spontaneously contracts. Now, when it is stretched, it can adapt pretty quickly to that new length and then relax. This is called the stress relaxation response, and that's what allows it to contract optimally when it's stretched. So this is ideal characteristic of smooth muscle, because we only need smooth muscle to contract at certain times on demand, and we're not even aware of it, like when your bladder fills, for example. So cardiac muscle also increases its strength of contraction in response to stretch. So that's kind of an overview of how the different types of muscle tissues vary and how they're similar. For the rest of the unit, we're going to focus on skeletal muscle tissue only. So I'm going to take a minute here to introduce you to skeletal muscles, which you're also learning in lab. Skeletal muscles, or whole muscles, are organs because they're composed of many different tissue types, not just skeletal muscle tissue. So this picture shows a muscle attached to the femur by a tendon, and surrounding the muscle is connective tissue. There's also connective tissue interwoven in between fascicles. That's the white that you see there. So that's two different kinds of tissue, skeletal muscle tissue and connective tissue. In addition, there are blood vessels embedded within that connective tissue, like arteries and veins. So there's blood tissue, and of course there must be smooth muscle in the wall of those vessels, and the vessels are lined by epithelial tissue. In addition, nerves are present to stimulate the muscle cells to contract. So we have all the basic categories of tissue. So we're going to look at how skeletal muscles function in this unit. And so we should know what their functions are. One of the major functions that we associate with skeletal muscles is the movement that our bodies can do, because these muscles act on the skeleton, moving bones at joints. Some skeletal muscles actually insert in the skin, like facial muscles, so we can have movement of our facial muscles for facial expression as well. So one function of skeletal muscle tissue is movement. Another is to just stabilize joints, because tendons will often cross a joint. But this stabilization will only happen as long as the muscle is taut. It's not too flaccid, so you have to have it in an isometric contraction, meaning a contraction that doesn't change the length of the muscle, and of course contraction versus stretch. Skeletal muscles also maintain posture the same way, control the opening and closing of our orifices like the urethra, rectum, and mouth. You might think that like the urethral opening and the rectal opening would have smooth muscle around it, and they do, but they also have skeletal muscle. So there's both. And then finally, one of the major functions of skeletal muscle tissue is to generate heat. In fact, up to 85% of your body heat is due to muscles breaking down ATP. Also, muscles need a lot of ATP, so they make ATP. And when they make ATP, it's not a 100% efficient process. So an organic nutrient is broken down. The energy that's released is used to make ATP, but not all of that energy is utilized. Some of it escapes as heat. So some energy is lost as heat when ATP is produced. Thank you very much. We'll talk more about skeletal muscle in the next lecture. Thank you.